Thank you so much. Well, I have only 4 slides and I have been given 40 minutes. That doesn't mean that I'll be, freezing you with 1 slide for 10 minutes each. I have to sit because I plan to use a frugal means to convey my words. So what I have done, I have prepared a write-up on the lecture, and I will use the PowerPoint to emphasize on certain key issues where I think a discussion would help all of us. Well, first of all, I thank Professor Peter Noringa and his staff at the Center for Frugal Innovation in Africa for inviting me to deliver this keynote address. In his first email, while informing me about the mandate of the center, Professor Noringa mentioned that the center would like to know more about the scholarship on frugal innovations emanating from experiences in India and elsewhere. The idea is to avoid reinventing the wheel while researching on African development. In order to do so, it is important that we understand how the idea of frugality has been explored by scholars of technological change and innovation. In this lecture, my objective to present a perspective on frugality in innovation based on heterodox economics scholarship. I would begin with an attempt to conceptualize frugality in the context of innovation. I then scan the 2 dominant schools of thought in the context of technological learning, namely the evolutionary school and the so-called technological capability school, and analyze how their views of technological activities fit into the logic of frugality I construct at the beginning. The third part of the lecture would deal with innovative activities in the informal sector and would try to understand the meaning and nuances of frugality in that context. I then make a couple of concluding remarks. Academic research on frugal innovation has expanded phenomenally in the recent past, where the term has been interchangeably used as inclusive innovation, reverse innovation, jugaad innovation, which is more specific to India perhaps, and bottom of the pyramid innovation. All these terminologies intend to signal a departure from the conventional conceptualization of innovation as acts of either great men or involving huge resources. However, the theoretical underpinning of much of this literature remains at best weak. In another paper with Hemant Kumar, I have underscored the major problems of using the term jugaad innovation indiscriminately. Here, I would limit my discussion to the term frugal innovation only. For Raju and Prabhu, who wrote an interesting book in the last year, frugal innovation means doing more with less. In their book, titled Frugal Innovation, they give many absorbing accounts of how leading multinational firms are nowadays spending billions of dollars to come up with innovations which are cheaper, environmentally sound, and scale neutral. That is, you can operate those technologies at any scale of operation, not necessarily at a large scale, all at the same time. These are usually dictated by changing norms of product standards, environmental concerns, and consumer awareness. To introduce these innovations, firms must change their organizational structure with a greater focus on consumer feedback and larger flexibilities in their R&D program. However, to what extent these activities conform to the notion of frugality remains debatable. Insofar as frugality refers to need satisfaction, that is a satisfying behavior as opposed to maximizing behavior, and simple search rule as opposed to constrained optimization, it remains unclear how the above activities may be characterized as frugal innovations. My conceptualization of frugality is based primarily on the works of Gerd Gigerenzer. In his book, Gut Feeling, which was published in the year 2007, and Simple Heuristics That Makes Us Smart, that's a book which was published way back in 1999, Gigerenzer and his colleagues attempt to draw a conceptual roadmap to understand frugality in the context of individual decision-making. According to them, we must analyze both the person who takes the decision and the environment in which the decision is taken in order to understand frugality. Frugality should therefore underscore not only what is achieved, but also, and perhaps more importantly, how it is achieved. Drawing upon his conceptual framework, I would like to claim that frugality in the context of innovation should entail a search process using simple hierarchical steps and intuitive reasoning rather than any clearly defined rule-based decision-making in optimization. Efforts to adapt to the environmental challenges through demonstrated capacity of learning and imitation and an emphasis on actual performance, practicability, or effectiveness rather than logical or scientific validation. What am I going to do? I'll keep this slide for your reference so that whatever discussion follows, you can relate to these concepts, and later on we can have a discussion to what extent these concepts or this way of conceptualizing frugal innovation helps us. With this idea of frugality in mind, I now turn to the major theoretical discussions in heterodox economics literature on innovation. It was Nathan Rosenberg who made a pioneering attempt to deviate from science-led innovation and warned the innovation scholars against excessive preoccupation with first commercial application of major technological breakthroughs. In Perspectives on Technology, Rosenberg gave strong empirical evidence in support of the argument that neither first applications nor major technological breakthroughs necessarily contributed to major economic success in the US industry. However, the empirical, more econometric research continued to use major technological breakthroughs to investigate the so-called Schumpeterian hypothesis of firm size and R&D in advanced industrialized countries. In 1987, in a paper with a provocative title, Why Americans Are Such Poor Imitators, Nathan Rosenberg and Edward Steinmuller attributed US's eroding competitive edge vis-à-vis Japan to the inability of the American industries to master minor adaptive innovations compared to their Japanese counterparts. Lack of interaction within firms and with suppliers and users of product lay at the heart of this inability. In fact, the failure of academic researchers in USA to understand the economic significance of these minor innovations and learning resulted in, according to them, in a misplaced understanding of Japanese export success being wrongly attributed to its low labor cost advantages and excessive governmental support to private industries. Ironically, in India, we are now doing the same thing with Chinese rise in competitiveness. I can come back to that later. The literature on technological change in economics passed through some watershed moments in the decade of 1980s. Beginning with the publication of Evolutionary Theory of Economic Change by Richard Nelson and Sidney Winter in the year 1982, the decade saw the emergence of country studies based on experiences of industrialization in Latin America, East Asia, and India, under the rubric of what has come to be known as the technological capability literature. The evolutionary school provided a systemic view on innovation and technological change, where diversity in firm-level capability, tacitness of knowledge, and institutional constraints shaped learning and technological trajectories of firms and industries. Retaining the Schumpeterian flavor of creative destruction, this body of literature emphasized on co-evolutionary dynamics between technology and institutional parameters through innovations. Abandoning optimization, scholars of evolutionary school also harped on the importance of heuristic-based learning and adaptive R&D in a firm's quest for technological change. One major offshoot of this thinking is the emergence of the literature on innovation systems, which seeks to analyze how innovation requires learning through interactions between industrial units, public research institutes, universities, and policy-making bodies. The literature on technological capability at the same time emerged primarily from the works of scholars like Chris Freeman, Martin Franzmann, Francis Stewart, Gustav Ranis, George Katz, and Sanjay Lal. Highlighting the absence of a technology shelf readily available to a firm in the less developed country, these studies analyze the nature of technological learning activities by these firms outside the formalized R&D activities and illustrated the importance of minor innovations at the shop floor level towards acquisition of technological capability, presumably in a path-dependent manner. Now, path dependence as a concept also opposed to the notion of optimization. Lal, 1987, in his book Learning to Industrialize, defines such capabilities as the capacity to select, absorb, assimilate, adapt, imitate, and improve upon given technologies, which could eventually culminate into capabilities to create new technologies. This conceptualization of technological capability recognized multiple sources of learning, that is, by doing and by observing, to make a technology work in a specific environment. Lal further categorizes capacities to select, absorb, and assimilate as know-how capabilities, and the other three types of capacities as know-why capabilities. The former seeks to make best possible use of a given technology, while the latter seeks to deepen the understanding of a technology, often at the cost of certain short-term gains in productivity. The process of technological capability acquisition, however, was not costless. First, the outcomes were uncertain, offering no guarantee to reach the highest level of capability even in the longer run. Firms, as a result, had the dilemma of investing in know-why building capabilities, since such an investment, on one hand, it locks in the long-term, the scarce capital to an uncertain process of technological learning, and on the other hand, it prevents them from accruing the gains in productivity, which could have been achieved through mastering know-how through much simpler production engineering. We have, in a paper with Professor Amit Shobhan Roy, we have shown in India, that is, the industry which engaged in itself with learning could not do much productivity gains, but the industry, electronics and electrical, I'm talking about mid-90s, which did not do much of technological learning, had major productivity gains visible. And interestingly, by a PhD thesis at this institute, Shifero also came to the same conclusion for the Ethiopian manufacturing industry. I'm talking about the ISS. Yeah. In addition, as the experiences of the Korean semiconductor industry suggest, growing know-why capabilities of LDC firms was a cause of concern for developed country firms, transfer of whose technologies was crucial to build up such capabilities. There are instances where developed country firms stop transfer of new technologies for fear of imitation and the consequent loss of market share. Few industries that pursue know-why-oriented technological capability, even in this scenario, had to bear higher risk and uncertainties associated with technological learning. In the Indian context, the success of the Indian pharmaceutical industry is worth noting. A trajectory of know-why-oriented technological learning resulted in a so-called process revolution in this sector, and not only helped India to become globally competitive in the generics market by becoming the pharmacy of the world, but also drastically reduced the lag in new drug launch, even when originator firms refused to launch their new drugs in India. So what I intend to say here is that the process revolution helped not only in the generics market, which is about older drugs, but it also quite successfully helped them launching new drugs, of course, not the first time, but the drugs which are not so old and for those the technologies are not so standardized. Even in that aspect, they did well. I would like to emphasize here that much of this technology acquisition process in the Indian pharmaceutical industry was driven by societal concern for affordable and accessible drugs shared by scientists and entrepreneurs as opposed to any strategic optimization. The nature of learning was also ad hoc, often relying on trial and error, where a few entrepreneurs reported to have used themselves or family members even to test efficacy of new processes they developed, not clinical trial of any kind. This, I believe, has strong overlaps with the characteristic of frugality that I had chalked out in the beginning. We have noted that environment is an important driver of frugality. An important environmental factor which drove such frugal innovations in developing countries was their ability to modify the intellectual property rights to suit the requirement of domestic industrialization and capability building efforts. While in the past, national governments could design its IPR laws to augment industrial capabilities of domestic countries, and the examples are there from US, Germany, Japan, and others, the intensification of international opinion in favor of globally homogenized intellectual property rights laws in the last 30 years severely dampened the prospect of technological learning in less developed economies and completely stopped the process with the inclusion of trade-related intellectual property rights in the World Trade Organization in the year 1995. In the changed scenario, it is beyond the jurisdictional capabilities of national governments to deviate from the TRIPS laws, unless, of course, under national emergencies, which has put a virtual halt to technological learning through the frugal means mentioned above. Apart from the changes in the institutional framework of IPR, technological learning was also hindered by the failure of academic scholars to provide adequate insights into the importance of such process and rally the policymakers behind this agenda in a comprehensive manner. In this context, I would mention the failure of the academic scholarship to combine the theoretical insights offered by the evolutionary school and the capability school in an effective manner. These two schools grew independently and failed to get benefited from each other's insights and expertise. For the capability school, the process of technology acquisition remained somewhat firm-centric, which could not incorporate the insights from the innovation system framework developed by the evolutionary school. The evolutionary school, on the other hand, remained preoccupied with developed countries for a rather long period and committed to analyze the process of technology acquisition in developing countries through initiating the technological catch-up project only in 2004. Moreover, the project has apparently not taken off well in many countries for its failure to develop a network of scholars working in the field in a fruitful way. Globalix is the only network which has survived over a decade, but no other network has been successful, in my view. The failure to develop a critical minimum mass of researchers and policy supporters on this issue has hindered collecting data on many related activities, in turn discouraging further research in this area. Today, in countries like India, I'm moving on the third part now, much of the kind of technological activities outlined above are observed outside the boundaries of formal sector. In the last few decades, we have witnessed a significant rise in the share of informal economy in India and other developing countries. Concomitantly, interest has grown among academic scholars to recognize informal economic spheres as reservoir of knowledge, skills, and creativity. Besides the traditional focus on the exploitative work conditions of this sphere, which has been occupied the major attention of research scholars starting from Arthur Lewis, sophistication has also come in defining informal economy in a more nuanced manner, where occupations are segregated in terms of the degree of informality, measured in terms of parameters like temporariness of an activity, nature of competitors, scale of activity, along with, of course, the conventional parameters like tax obligations and regulatory requirements. Indeed, People seem to join this sector with multiple motives and capabilities, rather than the motivations to avoid tax or regulatory mechanism which dominated the discussion in informal economy for a long time. However, this long neglect of informal sector by the scholars of innovation and technology has indeed created a vacuum of theoretical scholarship through which one would have liked to analyze the knowledge-generating activities in this sector. It is therefore a challenge of the current generation of researchers, all of us, to ground our discussion to suitable theoretical framework. With Hemant Kumar, we have explored motivations to undertake innovative activities in this sector, taking the example of grassroots innovations in India. Here, we follow the categorization done by the National Innovation Foundation and characterize these innovations, which are acted primarily by people belonging to lower socioeconomic strata with low education. There are some research groups, for example, at the University of Sussex. They include in it all innovations which are for the poor and village people. In fact, India has a long history of such technological interventions, like by the formal sector for poor people and villages. Application of science technology in rural areas called Astra being one of them. It may not be incorrect to see the genesis of such efforts during the India's freedom movement, the rural reconstruction program by Rabindranath Tagore, the creation of All India Village Industries Association by Gandhi and Kumarappa are some of them. People here undertake innovations due to factors ranging from curious nature, urge to solve problems faced by neighbor and family members, sustainable use of local raw materials, besides, of course, more extrinsic forms of motivations like monetary gains to find cheaper alternatives and growth in business. We also find evidence of motivation shifts, where motivation shift from intrinsic to extrinsic motivation as innovation progresses, and a significant portion of motivation become extrinsic once the innovation becomes a certainty ready for application. And this finding can give interesting clue on relationship between incentives and uncertainty. When incentives would matter, perhaps is the case when uncertainties are less. When uncertainties are more, people are guided by other factors, not necessarily by extrinsic incentives. Unlike the innovations in formal sector, grassroots innovations often do not have any clear timeline or budgetary specifications. Finances are also arranged from informal sources like friends and family members. Finally, the form of application of these technologies vary greatly, ranging from self-use to free distribution in the locality, to sale of technology locally, to tie up with formal sector firms, wider distribution, to tie up with research institutes for further development. These are the many forms of application of the technology which we have seen in our study. Their approach to intellectual property also varies accordingly. The data from the initial years of survey by the National Innovation Foundation in India show near complete ignorance and enthusiasm among the innovators about any formal intellectual property protection mechanism. Though over time they have been made aware of the significance of such protection, many still remain ignorant of the ways through which such intellectual properties are to be used. Since patents can only benefit if innovations are commercialized in a large scale, which is not automatic at least for these innovations intended to solve local problems, these intellectual properties have remained devoid of much use to them. In addition, putting undue thrust on scale-up and large-scale commercialization by the NIF seems to have had a demotivating effect on some innovators by inculcating a belief that large-scale commercialization is more important than solving local problems. With Kumar, in another paper, I have discussed how large-scale commercialization may depend on improving on aspects of an innovation like packaging, product standards, conforming to various standards and advertisement, which require a comprehensive system of diverse economic agents in place. One, therefore, needs to imagine an alternative model of diffusion for these innovations where the diversity of their own modes of application could be strengthened. This is purely the view that we have been sharing in our center, of course. The source of knowledge they use in their inventive efforts is also diverse. Local knowledge, experiences in the field or apprenticeship, traditional knowledge in various forms have shaped these innovative acts. Nowadays, due to the initiative of the National Innovation Foundation, experts from the formal sector also get to engage with such efforts at various stages of innovation. These innovations can take forms of modification of existing formal sector technologies to suit local conditions or improvisations over traditional knowledge. Several factors seriously impair any efforts to understand the knowledge source and learning dynamics in this sector. First of all, in India, no official survey is equipped to capture data on informal sources of learning. There is also a tendency in general among people involved in these activities to undermine the knowledge they themselves hold and innovative efforts they undertake. During my interaction with a farmer involved with shifting cultivation in a state in India, which is the far eastern state in India bordering Myanmar, he categorically insisted that he didn't introduce any change in the cultivation method in his entire lifetime. Until I provoked the translator to tweak the question and asked how come he didn't change his cultivation technique when the whole world was changing so much. In reply, he showcased 4 different types of shovels he used for cultivation, all bearing testimonies to his awareness of the changing nature of local availability of raw materials and to an extent concerns for efficiency. They learn not only by doing, but also by merely being there, observing others doing the thing, which is perhaps the reason why it is often difficult to decode their source of knowledge and the precise mechanism of learning. This fuzzy nature of learning and knowledge acquisition may have prevented collaboration between such innovators and the various state, non-state formal sector agents. Amit Basole, he reports a finding from some of the surveys in India that 90% of technical knowledge in India's unregistered small-scale industrial sector is developed in-house. Domestic collaboration as a source of such knowledge has reduced, which was already low, from 5% in 2001 to 2% in the year 2007. Foreign collaboration, of course, remained minuscule, less than 1%. What prevents more intense collaboration between these entities is an important research topic in itself. Few scholars from our center, Hemant Kumar and Fayaz Ahmed Sheikh, they report trust deficit between grassroots innovators and formal sector research institutes to be an important reason. I'm sure I would hear more about it from Dr. Rao's presentation. In this context, I wish to note that many papers published in the 2 special issues of African Journal of Science, Technology, Innovation and Development, which I could edit, have shown very interesting kind of cooperation to exist among firms and innovators located within the informal sector. These studies provoke me to think that cooperation has less coordination cost in the informal sector compared to its formal sector counterparts. Based on interactions with innovators and our understanding of the Indian technical education system, let me claim that one crucial reason for the lack of collaboration between formal sector scientists and informal sector innovators is perhaps the difference in the worldview on what constitutes a good technology. While for the innovators, a good technology is the one which is of daily use, a scientist puts more emphasis on the clarity of scientific principles. This conflict, however, is nothing new, at least in India. Rabindranath Tagore, I must say that Rabindranath Tagore is well known to an audience outside India for receiving the first Nobel Prize in Literature, first Nobel Prize outside the continent and the USA. But he also devoted much of his time and energy to research about an alternative education system in India and to develop a model of self-reliance that India could pursue after independence. He died, of course, much before, before independence in 1941, but he remains kind of an iconic figure in some parts of India. So he introduced a rural reconstruction program where he experimented with a model of self-reliance in pre-independent India, also faced similar criticisms about viability of rural technologies. In a write-up called Rural Welfare Method, he forcefully argued that daily utility of the devices developed by the villagers for him was a stronger proof of science than theoretical criticism. Incidentally, I'm told that this is a view also shared by Mao Zedong when he also initiated the projects on rural technological development in China. One wonders if this emphasis on usability, overriding the criteria of logical proof, echoes the condition of frugality noted by Gerd Grigerenzer, that frugality draws its credibility from performance in real-world environment rather than necessarily being logically valid. To explain the failure of appropriate technology movement in the decade of 1980s, Adrian Smith and others seem to suggest a very similar reason. For them, as the agenda of developing appropriate technology got incorporated in the mandate of many developing country governments' science and technology initiatives, it lost the essence of community well-being and local context in which the movement emerged. Fayaz Sheikh, in a paper, also show how state intervention in Pashmina shawl industry in Kashmir isolates local designers by introducing computerized design-making processes. To conclude, I argue that the concept of frugality in innovation has to take into account not only the final outcome of an innovation process, but also the entire process of innovation itself. It has to rely on heuristics rather than well-designed rule to solve a problem in the actual environment, even at the cost of being logically unsound, and demonstrate a learning dynamics. The heterodox approach in economics of technological change over the years has expanded its scope to analyze these parameters, but have mostly remained confined to formal sector organizations. In the wake of increasing informality of many developing economies, we need to adapt the heterodox economics insights, tools, and approaches in informal settings to understand the innovation dynamics in this sector. Insofar as our objective is to explore development potentials of frugal innovation, we also need to generate consensus among scholars of frugal innovation to focus on a key set of questions and, if possible, on a common set of methodological tools and conceptual framework. This is important to persuade policymaking in a desired direction and not to repeat the failures of appropriate technology movement and the technological capability scholarship. Thank you all for your attention.
Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. I think that your presentation is very well placed because what we're doing here today is also looking at practical projects. Oh, sorry. I need a mic.
Oh, yeah.
I'm sorry, I need a mic.
Use the microphone.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Again.
And turn it on.
Yes. Yes?
Oh, no.
I think I need the other one.
Thank you very much. Again, thank you very much. I was just saying that I think that your lecture is very well placed here, because what we're doing today in our center is also doing very practical research, and you give a clear background on a theoretical search that's still going on. And particularly what's interesting is that you emphasize the informal aspects, and particularly therefore also the inclusive elements, which are very relevant, particularly from the perspective of a developing country, and which is something that is not automatically guaranteed when you have a kind of view from the Western countries. I think it's a very, very well placed, and thank you very much for your interesting talk. What I would like to do is, I would like to ask you to gather a couple of questions for the speaker. Can I? Yes, sir, please. The best thing that you can say is, what I would like to do is, please say your name. Some, maybe most of people know you, but... Oh, sorry.
Does it work?
Yeah, no, it doesn't. I think you can better do this one.
What work?
Do this? Yes.
They both work. Well, my name is Prabhu Kandachar. I'm a professor from Delft University of Technology. Delft, we have been doing a lot of work on innovations for base of the pyramid, which includes reverse innovation, frugal innovation, all kinds of innovation, inclusive innovations. But when Professor Peter Knoring introduced this conference, the purpose, he also said that India has been quite ahead in the area of frugal innovations, whereas the other countries are not that ahead. You can copy it from, let us say, from India to other countries instead of reinventing the wheel. I think it's a very good objective. From that point of view, I was wondering, what is that so specific about India, which is not available in, what I say, Africa? Why is frugal innovations very much florescent, or grassroots innovations? You already talked about Anil Gupta and NIF and all those things. Why is it happening so much there? Even though I know that India, for instance, like Africa, is a space of constraints, very ideal platform for a generation of frugality. But Africa is also a space of constraints. Why is it not happening?
I didn't want to ask a question, I will run with the microphone.
Oh, okay. Yeah, well, I'm not sure if Africa doesn't have frugal innovations. I would say India, for some reason, as I said, I mean, it has a history from, Gandhi's time of emphasizing on charkha and self-reliance. It has a history to include this cottage industries, small-scale industries in policy making. But informal sector has largely been out of it. What is happening, Professor Anil Gupta's initiative as grassroots innovation movement is also built on a very strong prior movements like people science movements in India. So I think there is a kind of an institutional emphasis, formally and informally, which has been quite a lot in India. Probably that is the reason why I would not say this this is contributing to innovations, but I would say this is contributing to analysis of such innovations in India more meaningfully than in Africa. Because in Africa also, I have read a couple of books, I have seen a couple of papers while editing those two issues of the journal. Work is there. I mean, for example, in furniture industry in Nairobi, an author emphasizes how informal sector players are equally good in copying a design, and which is putting a constraint on formal sector to introduce new design. So they are quite quick in imitating new designs. But I don't know much about Africa, and so that's my constraint. I would not be able to give you more conclusive answer than this.
Yeah, fascinating lecture. I enjoyed it very much. I refer to the initial comments that Peter Norringa made, mentioning there are varieties of ways in which we can talk about frugal innovation, grassroots. I think you remembered something like 5 different types. And that sort of, I think, is the first challenge, to sort that out. What are we talking about? Because I think what you are talking about this morning is sort of bottom-up processes, those that take place within the formal sector, and you try to see to what extent connections, there are connections with the formal sector, and to what extent there is segmentation or no segmentation in institutional terms, and what are the consequences of that. But what I hear here most has been, and what I know myself about frugal innovation, which I'm not a student of that, I'm professor of local and regional development, is that frugal innovation from the north seen as multinationals trying to reach the bottom of the pyramid, which is a top-down process. So I think an important methodological issue right from the beginning is defining what are we talking about. That's the first point. The second point is that that you raised in the beginning or at the end of your talk. That is the methodological questions that and the set of research questions that we have to look at. In your talk, you talk primarily about evolutionary economics. I would have expected that you would talk more about evolutionary institutional economics. Yeah? I didn't hear you talk so much about institutions and institutional arrangements as being an entry point on which you can define a common set of questions. So I would like to have your reaction to that. Thank you very much.
And your name is Bert?
Bert Helmsing. Yeah.
Bert Helmsing, sorry.
Thank you so much for the questions. Well, I think evolutionary school also talks about institution, and that's why I said that they emphasize on co-evolution of technology and institution. However, I did not want to get into institutional economics too much because of the emphasis on formal sector institution in that literature. Because by formal sector institutions, we have just weeded out the informal sector activities. So there is no formal sector institution we can think of which have encouraged innovative activities in the informal sector. Could be primarily because of that I didn't want to go further about it. But in evolutionary economics, for example, when Nelson and Winter talks about farm routines, this is also an institution but more of an informal institution. So if I'm talking about developing a network, I'm possibly talking about more of a kind of a bottom-up informal practices that we can develop over time in order to come to the critical minimum mass of researchers on this issue. Well, what do I mean by frugal innovation? Well, actually, it's a difficult question. When I showed my write-up to a student of mine, he pointed out that possibly there are shades of frugality in an innovation process. And so the kind of innovation that I'm talking about, informal sector, compared to the kind of innovation you talked about, I would say the frugality, the degree of frugality would differ. Because in all innovations, there would be some elements of frugality. But the more important question for me is to understand how people define frugal innovations. What is the process that they are talking about? Unfortunately, mostly the emphasis has been on what they come up with, not how they come up with. And I'm emphasizing on that particular aspect, that in order to understand frugality, I need to be more inquisitive to know how the process of innovation has come about. Yeah, I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. I have a question about... Okay, my name is Laura Mann and I'm a researcher at the African Studies Center in Leiden. And my question is, in terms of sort of commercialization and in terms of the innovators getting the value of what they've innovated, could you say a little bit about the different experiences of sort of these bottom-up innovators in terms of whether they were able to profit or whether somebody else was able to profit? A little bit about that.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to talk for hours about it, but we don't have time for that. But we can talk about it more in informal meetings. You see, I have an objection to the concept of scaling up of such innovations. I was having a discussion with Professor Noringa yesterday. When we talk about scale up, we talk about a technology which has been developed in the laboratory under controlled experimental condition to manufacturing. Here, a technology has been developed already in an environmental context. It's not developed in a kind of a confounding experimental setup. So in order to scale up, probably you have to first scale it down to a laboratory, and then scale it up to other activity, other areas. Now, here there is a difference of opinion. Many scientists, and that is something I have referred to in my talk, this collaboration is not taking place quite fruitfully, at least in India. There is the scientists in many cases, I think Dr. Rao gives some more example, I'm not an insider there, but they have not shown much interest in sort of redesigning many of these innovations. Now, why that is not happening is a question. Other than that, my take would be, rather than trying to commercialize those innovation or trying to shift the design, which was, the technology was designed for a different audience, and when you are talking about large-scale commercialization, you are talking about a different set of consumers. Rather than trying to do that, if we could find out a group of people or locality where the needs are same, where the contexts are same, and try to talk about, transfer or diffusion of technologies in that kind of a framework. I mean, are you getting my point? I mean, by large-scale commercialization, we generally mean taking a technology from the village and coming to the city. Rather than doing that, if we do it like between villages transfer of technologies, maybe these technologies will have more intrinsic value there, yeah, rather than trying to commercialize, because it hasn't been quite successful in the Indian context.
Anyone else for a question? Or yes. Yes, you knew a microphone. Sorry. Please say your name, please.
It's being recorded. Okay, my name is Georgina Gomez, also from ISS. We met by Skype, I think. I'd like to build up on Bert Helmsing's question on institutions, because the word institutions has been abused and used and abused again and reused. So maybe it would be clearer if I offer a bit of a definition of what we mean by this, and that's the meso-level way of doing things. This way of doing things which is influenced by government, by the village, by a number of things. And I would like to know if you can offer us a little bit more on how you see this meso-level influence on frugal innovations. For example, you referred before to networks. You referred to India has a tradition of XYZ, Africa, well, you don't really know maybe, but this way of doing things must have a very big influence on the frugal innovation. It's not just an individual act. I'd like to know if you can offer us some knowledge on that.
Of course, surely it is not an individual act. And because it is not an individual act, many of us are also critical to this idea of, say, providing intellectual property rights to an individual for these innovative acts. We have collected some data on some innovators, and we are trying to see what kind of social and environmental factors motivate or demotivate them in doing that. We have found family members. I mean, families have a very important role there. I mean, the needs are first identified from family members. In very few cases, I would say, we have seen that people, I mean, we specifically asked this question, whom did you discuss with during the process of innovation? We didn't get a clear answer. Many of them said, well, with nobody perhaps. As I said, while referring to his question, I didn't say that India does more of frugal innovation than Africa. I said that India is better in trying to analyze or explore or investigate or scout these innovations than in Africa. That is an important difference. I'm not quite saying that India does more of frugal innovation. So, the institutional context, we have seen that the family level. And the other thing I would like to point out, but since I haven't done much research, I cannot be very sure, is there is an element of commons when you talk about village level interaction. And as I have noted here, that both in Africa and in India, what we found that cooperation to be much more easier among these players in the informal sector than cooperation in formal sector. So, that's the kind of things we are observing. There is no clear institutional structure that I can talk to you about. But the idea of commons and, the way family members conceptualize and provide support, because it doesn't have a clear timeline, as I said. So the finances are the most difficult part to arrange. I mean, they arrange for the finances withdrawing money from the daily family expenditures. So the way family looks at a particular innovation has a moral boosting efforts to them. Thanks.
Yes, I have a question going on this issue. My name is Caroline Nevian, I'm from TU Delft. And I worked in Delhi and Bangalore with Carol Upadhyay and Vignesh Ilavasaran. Maybe you know them. Vignesh Ilavasaran and Carol Upadhyay in Bangalore, and they looked at the innovation in the IT industry. And answering your question, what it was very important to them is that the fact that the whole multinational entry into Bangalore of the big companies, Indian institutions sort of backed off completely, sold even streets and parks. And in that whole development, which happened really fast, as Carol Upadhyay describes it, it becomes like a theater school. So a lot of young people started little IT businesses, doing their own thing, mimicking the multinational, global, cosmopolitan behavior. She has beautiful work on this, analyzing even up to the movements in the office, how to deal with hierarchies. But there you see that the sort of lack of institutional Indian or laissez-faire policy generated in Bangalore at least, and to an extent in Delhi, a whole large group of frugal innovators. And what I hear is that the mobile phone companies, for example in Kenya, are playing a role like that now too. And it depends what the government is going to do, or the institutions are going to do, because the young people, they are just going to mimic, they just go on. I mean, they need a new life.
Can you give a short reaction to this? Please.
I would just only say this much by actually supporting this view that the recent policy, the science, technology, innovation policy in India doesn't have a single word on informal sector. Thank you.
Okay, there is room for one question. Last question because of the time. Yes, please. Yes.
Hi, thank you. My name is Watu. I have a very quick question. You referred to the pharmaceutical sector in India, and you pointed out that process innovation went a long way because at the time patents were not on products. And then you talked a little bit about a form of frugal innovation where you mentioned that actually they would make the products and test them on family members. I wondered if you could give a few more examples on forms of frugal innovation in the pharmaceutical industry, considering it has different frameworks to do with safety and efficacy and so on.
Yeah, I mean, when I heard this about this example by an entrepreneur, I was shocked myself that, oh, are we using those medicine which have been tested on family members before getting them to the market? Well, the question of safety and efficacy is also not a very clearly defined concept. So, I would give you one example rather than trying to give more example of the kind of frugality, because frugality was everywhere. For example, they ran a whole business from inside a room. How did they search for raw materials, excipients? They were all like through informal interactions, friends, getting to know about some raw materials here, trying to change the color in their own way, talking to a doctor, everything happened. But coming back to the issue of safety and efficacy, it is important that we note that it is also an institutional factor rather than a scientific factor. For example, nowadays there is a talk of bioequivalent studies. That is, before you bring a generics into the market, you should see that the generics and the patented drug or the original drug has similar absorption pattern in the body. This is to ensure safety. At the same time, you also have a list of drugs approved by WHO on one hand and US FDA on the other hand, where they would not require to go through bioequivalent studies. So they have bio waivers. Again, to ensure easy access. More interesting part of it, the list of the WHO doesn't match with the list of US FDA. So there are certain drugs which are qualified for bio waivers by WHO, but which are not qualified for waivers by US FDA and vice versa. So the question of safety and efficacy, I would say it's an institutional issue. A lot of things are being done on that. So it's far from being a settled issue in the first place. Right? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think it was an interesting discussion. Thank you, Dr. Bhaduri, for answering the questions, also for the audience for raising the questions, but we have to move on. And